Emily Chen had been called many things during her 6 months behind the marble reception desk of the Grand Riverside Hotel. Incompetent, slow, unqualified. Every insult from Richard Morrison, the general manager, felt like a paper cut, small but stinging. She could have ended it all with 3 words, "I'm the owner's daughter," but she didn't. Because this wasn't about proving who she was. It was about discovering who she could become. And on this particular Tuesday morning, as Richard's footsteps echoed across the lobby floor, Emily had no idea that everything was about to change in ways she never imagined.
Quick pause. Before we continue, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Grand Riverside Hotel, casting geometric shadows across the polished marble floor. Emily stood behind the reception desk, her posture perfect despite the exhaustion that had settled into her bones. She'd been awake since 5, preparing herself mentally for another day of quiet endurance. The hotel lobby was a masterpiece of modern luxury. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling like frozen waterfalls. Leather sofas in deep burgundy were arranged in intimate clusters. Everything whispered wealth, power, and exclusivity. And Emily, in her crisp navy blazer and modest silver name tag, was practically invisible against this backdrop of opulence. She logged into the reservation system, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency. 6 months ago, she'd barely known how to use the software. Now she could navigate it blindfolded. That was the point of all this, to learn every aspect of the business from the ground up, to understand what it truly meant to serve people, to see the empire her father had built through the eyes of those who made it run. The elevator chimed. Emily didn't need to look up to know who was arriving. Richard Morrison had a particular way of walking, heavy footsteps that announced his presence before he came into view, as if the world should prepare itself for his arrival. Richard was 45, with silver threading through his dark hair in a way that might have been distinguished if not for the permanent scowl etched into his features. He'd been the general manager of the Grand Riverside for 3 years, and he ran the hotel with an iron fist wrapped in a designer suit. He approached the desk, his eyes scanning Emily with the same disdain he might show a smudge on a wine glass. Emily straightened, meeting his gaze with calm professionalism. Richard dropped a stack of papers on the counter between them. The sound echoed like a judge's gavel. His lips pressed into a thin line as he tapped the top document with one manicured finger. Emily glanced down at the papers. They were guest complaint forms, 3 of them. Her stomach tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. She picked up the first form and read it carefully. A guest in room 847 complained about late room service. The second form detailed a mix-up with wake-up calls. The third mentioned delayed luggage delivery. As she read, Richard's voice cut through the quiet lobby like a blade. He explained with barely concealed satisfaction that these mistakes were unacceptable. The Grand Riverside Hotel maintained a reputation built over 25 years. Every error reflected poorly not just on the staff member responsible, but on him personally. His tone suggested that Emily's mere existence was an affront to his carefully cultivated professional image. Emily set the papers down gently. She took a breath before responding, keeping her voice steady and respectful. She explained that the room service delay occurred during a system outage in the kitchen, something completely beyond reception's control. The wake-up call issue had happened on her day off. She showed him the schedule on her tablet to confirm. And the luggage delivery delay was due to the bellhop being called away for a medical emergency with another guest. Richard's jaw tightened. Facts, apparently, were inconvenient things. He waved her explanations away as if swatting at gnats. In his view, a good receptionist would have somehow prevented all of these issues through sheer force of will. He leant forward, close enough that Emily could smell his expensive cologne, and told her that perhaps she wasn't cut out for hospitality work. Emily felt heat rising to her cheeks, but she refused to look away. 6 months of this treatment had taught her something valuable about herself. She was stronger than she'd ever imagined. Every dismissive comment, every public humiliation, every moment of being treated as less than human had forged something unbreakable inside her.
She could have ended this in a heartbeat. One phone call to her father, one revelation of her true identity, and Richard Morrison would be apologizing so profusely he'd run out of words. But that wasn't why she was here. Her father, James Harrison, had built a hotel empire worth over $2 billion. He'd started with a single budget motel 40 years ago and expanded to 37 properties across the United States. Emily had grown up in boardrooms and luxury suites, had attended the best schools, had never wanted for anything material. But she'd also watched her father's employees from a distance, had seen the way some managers treated their staff when they thought no one important was watching. She'd witnessed the subtle cruelties, the casual dismissals, the way power could corrupt even good people. When she'd approached her father 2 years ago with her idea to work anonymously in one of his hotels, to truly understand the business from the inside, he'd been skeptical, but she'd convinced him. She'd argued that when she eventually joined the executive team, she needed to have experienced what it meant to be at the bottom of the hierarchy. She needed to earn her place, not inherit it. So here she stood, absorbing Richard's criticism with grace, knowing that every moment of this experience was teaching her lessons no business school could provide. Richard finally stepped back, satisfied that he'd made his point. He straightened his tie and informed Emily that he'd be watching her performance closely. One more mistake, he said, and there would be consequences. The words hung in the air like a threat. Emily nodded once, acknowledging his warning without agreeing to its unfair terms. Richard turned and walked toward his office, his footsteps fading into the distance. The moment he disappeared, Emily's colleague, Sophia, emerged from the back office. Sophia was 23, with warm brown eyes and an easy smile that had made Emily's first weeks bearable. She'd been working at the Grand Riverside for 2 years and had her own collection of Richard Morrison stories. Sophia approached the desk and stood beside Emily, her presence a silent show of support. They didn't ask if Emily was okay. They'd been through this routine enough times that questions were unnecessary. Instead, she simply stood there, shoulder to shoulder, a reminder that Emily wasn't alone. Emily gave her a small smile. Friendships forged under difficult circumstances had a particular strength to them. Sophia had no idea who Emily really was, and that made their connection more genuine. Here, Emily wasn't James Harrison's daughter or a future executive. She was just Emily, a receptionist who showed up on time, worked hard, and treated everyone with kindness. This was what she'd learned over 6 months, that hospitality wasn't about marble lobbies or Egyptian cotton sheets. It was about making people feel seen and valued. Around 11, the lobby began to fill with the lunch crowd. The hotel's restaurant, Riverside Grill, was popular with local business people. Emily watched them stream through the entrance, most barely glancing at the reception desk. She'd become part of the furniture, invisible in the way that service workers often are. Then she saw him.
A man in his early 30s entered to the revolving doors, and Emily's breath caught in her throat. David Chen, her ex-fiancé. The man she'd been engaged to 2 years ago, before everything fell apart. David looked exactly as she remembered. Tall, athletic build, that confident stride that had first attracted her. He was dressed in an expensive charcoal suit, his dark hair perfectly styled. And he wasn't alone. A woman walked beside him, her hand resting possessively on his arm. She was stunning in that effortless way some people achieved, with long auburn hair and a dress that probably cost more than Emily's monthly salary as a receptionist. Emily's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd known, intellectually, that she might encounter someone from her previous life. The Grand Riverside was one of her father's flagship properties, and it attracted exactly the kind of people who moved in her family's circles. But knowing something was possible and experiencing it were two entirely different things. David and the woman were heading toward the restaurant, laughing about something. They would pass right by the reception desk. Emily felt frozen, her mind racing through scenarios. Would he recognize her? How would she explain what she was doing working as a receptionist? Should she duck down and pretend to look for something under the desk? But even as these panicked thoughts swirled, another part of her, the part that had been strengthened by 6 months of Richard's abuse, steadied itself. She had nothing to be ashamed of. This was her choice, her journey. David's opinion of her life decisions no longer mattered. She stood tall, her hands folded calmly in front of her, and watched them approach. Emily's past collides with her present as her ex-fiancé walks into the hotel. But the encounter that's about to unfold will trigger a chain of events that no one could have anticipated, least of all Richard Morrison.
David and his companion were 10 feet away when his gaze swept across the lobby and landed on Emily. She saw the exact moment recognition flickered in his eyes. His steps faltered, almost imperceptibly. The woman on his arm continued forward, tugging him slightly, and he recovered, but his eyes remained locked on Emily. They reached the reception desk, ostensibly because the restaurant entrance was just beyond it. David stopped, seemingly unable to help himself. His companion looked at him quizzically, then followed his gaze to Emily. Emily watched David's face cycle through emotions. Shock, confusion, and then something that looked uncomfortably like pity. She spoke first, her voice professionally pleasant. She greeted him by name, asking if she could help him with anything today. David's mouth opened slightly. He glanced at his companion, then back at Emily. The question in his eyes was obvious. "What are you doing here?" But he didn't voice it. Instead, he responded that they were just heading to lunch, though his tone was awkward, uncertain. The woman with him, however, had no such hesitation. She looked Emily up and down, her gaze lingering on the name tag, then on the modest blazer. Her smile was sharp as she commented on what a coincidence it was, running into Emily here. She introduced herself as Madison, extending her hand in a way that showed off an impressive diamond engagement ring. Emily shook her hand, her own fingers ringless and professional. She congratulated them warmly, genuinely. Whatever heartbreak she'd experienced 2 years ago had healed. David belonged to another lifetime. But Madison wasn't finished. She tilted her head, her voice dripping with false sympathy, as she mentioned how unexpected it was to see Emily working as a receptionist. She had heard, through mutual friends, that Emily had taken some time away from her family business. She hadn't realized it was quite this dramatic a departure. The words were calculated, designed to embarrass. Emily recognized the tactic. She'd seen similar power plays in boardrooms and charity galas her entire life. Women like Madison used information as weapons, revealing just enough to make their targets squirm while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. David shifted uncomfortably beside Madison, his jaw tight. He said something about needing to get to their reservation, his hand moving to the small of Madison's back in an attempt to steer her away. But Emily was already responding, her voice calm and unbothered. She explained that she believed in understanding all aspects of a business before presuming to lead it. Some lessons, she noted, couldn't be learned from an executive suite. Her smile was genuine as she added that everyone should spend time in service roles. It taught invaluable lessons about humanity and humility. The words landed with quiet power. Madison's smile faltered slightly. David's expression shifted to something Emily couldn't quite read, perhaps respect, perhaps regret. He nodded slowly, told Emily it was good to see her, and guided Madison toward the restaurant. Emily watched them disappear through the frosted glass doors of Riverside Grill. Her hands trembled slightly, and she realized she'd been gripping the edge of the counter. Sophia materialized beside her again, having witnessed the entire exchange from the back office doorway. Sophia's whispered comment was both sympathetic and impressed. She'd seen the engagement ring, had picked up on the tension, and had watched Emily handle the situation with grace. She offered to cover the desk if Emily needed a moment to collect herself. Emily shook her head. She was fine. And surprisingly, she meant it. 2 years ago, when she and David had ended their engagement, she had felt like her world was collapsing. They had grown up in the same social circles, had been the perfect couple on paper. Both from wealthy families, both educated at elite universities, both groomed for leadership roles. But beneath the perfection, there'd been a fundamental disconnect. David had loved the idea of Emily Harrison, daughter of a hotel magnate, future co-CEO of a billion-dollar empire. He'd never quite seen Emily herself, the woman who wanted to travel without security details, who preferred diner coffee to champagne,
who thought her family's wealth carried responsibilities, not just privileges. The breakup had devastated her at first, but it had also freed her. It had allowed her to step away from expectations and discover what she actually wanted from life. And what she discovered was that she wanted to earn her place in her father's company to prove to herself and everyone else that she was capable of more than just inheriting power. The afternoon progressed. Emily handled check-ins and check-outs, answered questions about local attractions, arranged transportation for guests. The work was routine but never monotonous. Each person brought their own story, their own needs, their own moments of connection. Around 3 o'clock, Richard emerged from his office. He strode across the lobby with purpose, his eyes scanning the space with the intensity of a general surveying a battlefield. His gaze landed on Emily, and something in his expression made her pulse quicken. This wasn't his usual dismissive disdain. This was something sharper, more calculated. He approached the desk and placed his phone face down on the marble surface between them. His voice was low, controlled, but Emily could hear the undercurrent of satisfaction in it. He informed her that he needed to speak with her in his office immediately. There was a matter of serious concern that required her immediate attention. Emily glanced at Sophia, who shrugged slightly, equally confused. The afternoon shift didn't officially start for another hour, but another receptionist could cover if necessary. Emily nodded to Richard, logged out of her computer, and followed him across the lobby. Richard's office was on the second floor, accessible by a discreet staircase near the business center. The walk felt longer than usual. Emily's mind raced through possibilities. Had she made a mistake she wasn't aware of? Had another complaint come in? Or was this about the encounter with David? But how would Richard even know about that?
The office door clicked shut behind them with a finality that made Emily's stomach clench. Richard moved behind his desk, but didn't sit. Instead, he stood with his arms crossed, his posture radiating authority and barely contained triumph. He began speaking slowly, deliberately. Over the past few weeks, he explained, he'd been conducting a thorough review of all staff performance. The Grand Riverside Hotel had standards to maintain, and unfortunately, not everyone was meeting them. Emily's performance, specifically, had been consistently below par. Multiple guests had complained. Her efficiency ratings were the lowest in the department, and just today, he'd received reports that she'd been engaging in inappropriate personal conversations with guests during work hours. Emily's brow furrowed. Everything he was saying was demonstrably false. She had excellent guest feedback. She'd seen the surveys herself. Her efficiency ratings were actually among the highest, something Sophia had mentioned just last week. And just today, he'd received reports that she'd been engaging in inappropriate personal conversations with guests during work hours. She started to respond, to point out these discrepancies, but Richard raised his hand to silence her. He wasn't finished. He moved around his desk and picked up a folder, which he opened with theatrical precision. Inside were papers, documents that he claimed were performance reviews and incident reports spanning her entire 6-month tenure. Emily's eyes scanned the pages as he showed them to her. They were formal, official-looking documents on hotel letterhead. But something was off. She'd never seen these reports before. She'd never been asked to sign any formal performance reviews. The dates on some of the incident reports corresponded to days when she'd been working flawlessly, days when guests had specifically complimented her. Her mind worked quickly, piecing together what was happening. Richard had fabricated these documents. He'd created an entire paper trail of poor performance, building a case to fire her. But why? She'd been annoying him, certainly, but this level of effort suggested something more than simple irritation. Richard closed the folder and set it deliberately on his desk. He walked to his office window, looking out over the city, his back to Emily. His next words were measured, almost philosophical. He spoke about how some people, despite their best intentions, simply weren't suited for certain roles. The hospitality industry required a particular type of person, someone with natural grace, inherent sophistication, an understanding of luxury that couldn't be taught.
Some people had it, others didn't. The implication was clear and cruel. Emily, in Richard's view, lacked the breeding and background for this environment. The irony was so sharp it was almost funny. Here was Richard Morrison, who'd grown up middle class in Ohio and worked his way up through sheer ambition and ruthlessness, telling Emily that she didn't belong in a luxury hotel because of her background. Emily remained silent, letting him continue. Richard turned back to face her, and now his expression shifted to something almost sympathetic, although the effect was undermined by the coldness in his eyes. He explained that he'd decided to let her go, effective immediately. The hotel would provide 2 weeks' severance pay, more than generous considering her performance issues. She should collect her personal belongings and leave by the end of the day. The room felt airless. 6 months of work, 6 months of learning and growth and quiet endurance, dismissed in an instant. Emily's hands clenched into fists at her sides, but she kept her voice steady when she finally spoke. She asked him directly if he'd fabricated those reports. Richard's eyebrows rose in mock offense. He suggested that such an accusation was inappropriate and further demonstrated her unsuitability for professional environments. Everything in that folder was documented fact, witnessed, and verified. Emily knew she could end this right now. One phone call to her father, one revelation of her identity. Richard would be destroyed, his career finished. The temptation was almost overwhelming, but something held her back. If she revealed herself now, it would feel like using her privilege as a weapon, no different than how Richard used his power to abuse his staff. She'd spent 6 months trying to understand what it meant to be powerless in the system. Walking away now with her head high and her integrity intact felt like the stronger choice. She met Richard's gaze directly and told him she'd collect her things. Her voice didn't waver. She didn't argue or plead or threaten. She simply nodded once and turned toward the door. Richard's voice stopped her just as she had her hand on the doorknob. He mentioned, almost casually, that he'd be calling her references to inform them of her termination. Professional courtesy, he claimed, though they both knew it was vindictiveness. He wanted to ensure she'd struggle to find another position. Emily paused, but didn't turn around. She told him to do what he felt he needed to do. Then she opened the door and walked out, her spine straight, her dignity intact. Fired and humiliated, Emily faces a choice: reveal her true identity and destroy Richard, or maintain her anonymity and lose everything she's worked for. But what neither Richard nor Emily know is that someone else has been watching, documenting, and planning their own move.
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Emily descended the stairs from Richard's office in a daze, her mind spinning. The lobby stretched before her, suddenly unfamiliar despite 6 months of familiarity. Guests moved through the space, oblivious to the small personal catastrophe that had just occurred. The normalcy of it all felt surreal. Sophia was at the reception desk, helping a couple check in. She glanced up as Emily approached, and her smile faltered when she saw Emily's expression. The couple collected their keycards and moved toward the elevators. The moment they were out of earshot, Sophia grabbed Emily's arm and pulled her behind the desk, into the small alcove that offered a semblance of privacy. Emily explained what had happened, her voice flat with shock. Sophia's face cycled through disbelief, anger, and finally something that looked like determination. She'd known Richard was difficult, but fabricating documents crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. This wasn't just unfair management, it was potential fraud. Emily shook her head slowly. Fighting this would require revealing who she was, and she wasn't ready to do that. Not yet. Not like this. She'd started this journey with a purpose, and ending it by wielding her father's power felt like admitting defeat. She told Sophia she'd be fine.
that she had options, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. Sophia wasn't convinced. She mentioned something that made Emily pause. About 2 months ago, Sophia had noticed Richard spending unusual amounts of time in his office after hours, well past when he normally left. She thought it odd at the time, but hadn't pursued it. And there'd been other things, missing inventory reports, budget discrepancies that didn't quite add up. Sophia had mentioned these concerns to another manager once, but nothing had come of it. The implication hung in the air between them. What if Richard's vendetta against Emily wasn't personal at all? What if he was covering for something else, using Emily as a convenient scapegoat? Before Emily could respond, the elevator chimed. Both women looked up as the doors opened, and Emily's breath caught for the second time that day. Her father, James Harrison, stepped into the lobby, flanked by 2 people Emily recognized from the corporate office, Sarah Chen, the chief operating officer, and Marcus Peters, the head of legal affairs. Panic flooded through Emily's system. This couldn't be happening. Not today, not now. Her father's visits were usually scheduled weeks in advance, with the entire staff preparing for his arrival like soldiers readying for inspection. This unannounced appearance meant something significant was happening, something that had nothing to do with Emily's situation, but was about to collide with it in spectacular fashion. James Harrison was 60, with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. He'd built his empire through intelligence, hard work, and a genuine belief that business could be both profitable and ethical. He moved through the lobby with the confidence of a man who'd earned every success, and his eyes scanned the space with the attention to detail that had made him legendary in the hospitality industry. Emily did the only thing she could think of. She ducked. She literally crouched behind the reception desk, her heart hammering, feeling ridiculous and panicked in equal measure. Sophia stared at her like she'd lost her mind, mouthing silent questions. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. Richard Morrison had spotted James Harrison entering the lobby from his position near the bar. Emily heard his footsteps hurrying across the marble floor, heard the obsequious tone in his voice as he greeted the owner of the hotel chain with exaggerated deference. From her position behind the desk, Emily could hear everything. Richard was explaining that this was an unexpected honor, that the hotel was running perfectly, that all systems were operating at peak efficiency. James Harrison's response was polite but cool. He mentioned that this was an unscheduled inspection, that he liked to see how his properties operated when they weren't expecting him. Richard's voice took on a slightly nervous edge. He offered to give James a personal tour, to show him the recent renovations to the executive suites, to discuss the positive financial reports. James declined, stating that he preferred to conduct his own observations, but that he'd like to speak with several staff members randomly. He wanted authentic perspectives on how the hotel was really running. Emily's stomach dropped. She could predict where this was going. She was crouched behind a reception desk in full uniform, hiding from her own father while he conducted a surprise inspection of a hotel she'd been fired from an hour ago. This was beyond embarrassing. It was catastrophic. Sophia, bless her heart, was thinking quickly. She reached down and grabbed Emily's arm and whispered urgently. There was a supply closet adjacent to the back office. If Emily could get there without being seen, she could wait until the inspection party moved to another area of the hotel. It was a terrible plan, but Emily didn't have a better one. She nodded, and Sophia moved to the front of the desk, strategically positioning herself to block the view of anyone who might glance in their direction. Emily, feeling absolutely ridiculous, crawled along the floor behind the desk, staying below the marble counter. She reached the doorway to the back office, slipped through, and then into the supply closet Sophia had mentioned. The closet was small, barely 6 feet square, filled with office supplies and extra linens. Emily closed the door behind her and leaned against it, her heart racing. This was absurd.
She was a 27-year-old woman with an MBA from Wharton hiding in a supply closet from her father while her vindictive ex-boss showed him around. She pulled out her phone, the screen's glow providing the only light in the cramped space. She had text messages from Sophia, sent in rapid succession. Her father's party was moving through the ground floor. They'd stopped to speak with housekeeping staff. Richard was becoming increasingly nervous, though he was hiding it well. Sophia had overheard Marcus Peters, the legal director, mention something about financial irregularities that had triggered this surprise visit. Emily's eyes widened in the darkness. Financial irregularities. Sophia's earlier comments about missing reports and budget discrepancies, Richard's sudden desperate need to fire her today, the pieces were connecting in ways that painted a disturbing picture. She was so focused on her phone that she almost didn't hear the voices outside the supply closet. But then they registered, close and getting closer. Her father's distinctive baritone, Sarah Chin's professional alto, and Richard's increasingly strained tenor. They were right outside. Emily held her breath, pressed against the back wall of the closet, surrounded by reams of printer paper and stacks of towels. Through the thin door, she could hear every word. Richard was explaining his management philosophy: high standards, consistent enforcement, zero tolerance for mediocrity. Sarah Chin asked about staff retention rates. There was a pause, and Emily could imagine Richard's uncomfort. The Grand Riverside had high turnover, something that was unusual in the Harrison hotel chain, which prided itself on employee loyalty. Richard deflected, mentioning that the hospitality industry always had turnover, that some people simply weren't suited for luxury service. James Harrison's response was sharp. He noted that the other properties in the chain didn't have this problem, that maybe the issue wasn't with the staff, but with the management approach. The temperature in the hallway seemed to drop. Emily could picture Richard's face, the forced smile, the barely concealed anger at being challenged. His response was defensive, listing his accomplishments, the hotel's high guest satisfaction ratings, the revenue increases under his tenure. Marcus Peters spoke next, and his tone was formal, legal. He mentioned that they'd received several anonymous reports over the past month about workplace conditions at the Grand Riverside, allegations of harassment, discrimination, and potential fraudulent documentation. The corporate office took such claims seriously and needed to investigate thoroughly. Emily's eyes widened in the darkness. Anonymous reports. Someone else had been documenting Richard's behavior, building a case against him. But who?
Richard's voice was rising now, defensive and angry. He demanded to know who had made these accusations, insisted they were baseless, likely from disgruntled employees he'd rightfully terminated. He was being set up, he claimed, by people who couldn't meet professional standards. James Harrison cut him off. His voice was calm, but carried an edge that Emily recognized from childhood, the tone that meant he was truly angry but maintaining control. He stated that Richard would cooperate fully with the investigation, that all personnel files would be audited, and that Marcus would be conducting interviews with staff members. If the allegations proved accurate, there would be consequences. The conversation moved away, footsteps receding down the hallway. Emily remained frozen in the closet for several long minutes, processing what she'd just heard. Richard was being investigated. Someone had reported him, and she had walked into the middle of this situation on the worst possible day. Her phone buzzed. Another text from Sophia. "They're gone to the second floor. Richard, looks like he's going to be sick. Are you okay?" Emily typed back that she was fine, that she'd wait a few more minutes before emerging. But as she stood in the darkness of the supply closet, surrounded by the mundane supplies of hotel operations, a different thought occurred to her. She pulled up her work email on her phone, scrolling back through months of messages. Richard had often sent her tasks via email, documenting instructions and deadlines. She began forwarding key emails to her personal account, messages that contradicted his fabricated reports, emails showing dates she had completed tasks perfectly, communications proving her competence. If there was going to be an investigation, she could contribute evidence. Not as Emily Harrison, daughter of the owner, but as Emily Chen, receptionist who'd been wrongfully terminated.
She could fight back without revealing her identity, could seek justice as the person she'd been for the past 6 months, rather than the person she'd been before. The door to the supply closet opened suddenly, flooding the small space with light. Emily's heart stopped. Sophia stood in the doorway, her expression urgent. She whispered quickly that they had a problem. David, Emily's ex-fiancé, had apparently mentioned to someone at lunch that he'd seen Emily Harrison working at the reception desk. Word had spread through the restaurant, and now multiple people were asking questions. Emily closed her eyes. Of course, David's companion, Madison, probably couldn't resist sharing that juicy piece of gossip. The mysterious disappearance of Jones Harrison's daughter, now revealed to be working as a lowly receptionist at one of his own hotels. It was too good a story not to share. Sophia explained that some guests had approached the reception desk asking if it was true that the owner's daughter was working there. Sophia had deflected, but it was only a matter of time before someone asked Richard directly, or before James Harrison himself heard the rumors. Emily stepped out of the closet, her mind racing. Everything was unraveling faster than she could process. Her careful anonymity, maintained for 6 months, was disintegrating. Richard was being investigated, her father was in the building, and she'd just been fired. She needed to make a decision, and she needed to make it now. Continue hiding, let her father's investigation play out without her involvement, and potentially lose the opportunity to contribute her perspective. Or step forward, reveal herself, and risk losing the authenticity of everything she'd experienced. Before she could decide, her phone rang. The caller ID showed her father's personal cell phone number. Emily stared at it, her thumb hovering over the screen. Sophia looked at her questioningly. Emily answered. Her father's voice was controlled but concerned. He asked where she was, if she was safe. Someone had told him you were rumors about her working at the Grand Riverside. Was it true? And if so, why hadn't she told him she was at this property specifically? They'd agreed she'd be working at one of the smaller hotels on the West Coast, not at a flagship property where she might be recognized. Emily took a breath and explained. The West Coast placement had fallen through due to staffing issues, and she'd been offered a position at the Grand Riverside instead. She'd taken it, thinking she could maintain her anonymity in a large hotel in a major city. It had worked for 6 months. She'd learned everything she'd hoped to learn, and more. James was silent for a long moment. Then he asked a question that surprised her. Did she know why he was at the hotel today? Emily admitted she'd overheard part of his conversation with Richard. Anonymous reports about workplace conditions and financial irregularities. Her father made a sound that might have been a bitter laugh. He told her that the anonymous reports had come from her, or rather from multiple staff members who'd been emboldened by her example. Emily's confusion must have been evident in her silence. Her father explained that while she'd been working anonymously, she'd been demonstrating a different kind of leadership, not through authority or position, but through behavior. She'd shown other staff members that it was possible to maintain dignity in the face of abuse, to support one another, to document problems rather than simply endure them. Several employees had reached out to corporate HR over the past month, citing Emily's quiet strength as the reason they'd finally spoken up. The revelation hit Emily like a wave. She'd thought she was on a solitary journey of discovery, but she'd actually been inspiring a quiet revolution. The changes she wanted to make in her father's company were already happening not through policy memos or executive decisions, but through the simple act of treating people with respect and dignity. Her father's voice softened. He told her that Richard Morrison had just been suspended pending investigation. The preliminary audit of his files revealed falsified reports, skimmed expense accounts, and a pattern of harassment that violated every policy the Harrison hotel chain stood for. He asked Emily if she had experienced any of this directly. Emily looked at Sophia, who was watching her with growing understanding. Emily told her father, yes, she'd experienced it all. In fact, she'd been fired just an hour ago on fabricated grounds. She had documentation, emails, and evidence that could contribute to the investigation. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then her father asked a simple question. What did she want to do?
It was the same question he had asked her 2 years ago, when she'd proposed this entire plan. He'd never tried to talk her out of it, never insisted she take a traditional path. He'd always respected her autonomy, even when he worried about her safety or her choices. Emily took a breath and answered. She wanted to complete what she had started. She wanted to participate in the investigation, not as the owner's daughter, but as a staff member who'd experienced Richard's management firsthand. She wanted her testimony to carry the same weight as any other employee's testimony, to be evaluated on its merit rather than her family connection. James was quiet for another moment. Then he agreed, with one condition. She needed to meet with him privately, as his daughter, before participating in the investigation as a staff member. There were things he needed to know, assurances he required as her father, not as the owner of the hotel chain. Emily agreed. They arranged to meet in one of the penthouse suites away from the main areas where staff and guests might see them together. She had 30 minutes to compose herself and gather her documentation. After hanging up, Emily turned to Sophia and did something she should have done months ago. She told her the truth. Not all of it, not the full story of her engagement to David or her family's wealth, but the essential fact. She was James Harrison. Her daughter, she'd be working anonymously to understand the business from the inside, and she was sorry for the deception. Sophia's reaction surprised her. Instead of anger or betrayal, there was understanding. She'd suspected, she admitted. Little things hadn't added up. Emily's education, her knowledge of business operations, the way she handled difficult guests with the confidence of someone who'd grown up in luxury hotels. Sophia had chosen not to say anything because she'd respected Emily's reasons, whatever they were.
The two women stood in the back office, the weight of revelation hanging between them. Then Sophia smiled and told Emily that she'd been the best receptionist the Grand Riverside had ever had, regardless of who her father was. That meant something. Emily gathered her things from her locker, personal items, a sweater, photos she'd printed of the staff at various team gatherings. 6 months of life condensed into a small box. She changed out of her uniform in the staff bathroom, putting on jeans and a simple blouse she kept for after-shift occasions. Looking at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked younger somehow, less polished than the Emily Harrison who'd walked away from corporate life 2 years ago, but also stronger, more grounded. The penthouse suite was on the 23rd floor, accessible only by a special elevator key. Emily rode up alone, watching the numbers climb, feeling the physical sensation of rising while emotionally feeling like she was returning to Earth after a long journey. The doors opened onto a private hallway with only 2 doors. She knocked on the one her father had specified. James Harrison opened the door himself. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Then he pulled her into a hug, tight and paternal, the kind of embrace that communicated worry and relief and love all at once. Emily hadn't realized how much she'd needed this until it was happening. They sat in the suite's living area, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. Her father poured them both coffee from the service that had been prepared, and for several minutes they simply talked as father and daughter. He'd worried about her every single day of the past 6 months. He'd wanted to call, to check on her, to ensure she was safe and treated well, but he'd honored their agreement, had stayed away to let her have this experience authentically. Emily told him about the small moments that had defined her time at the Grand Riverside. The elderly guest who'd asked for her by name every time he stayed at the hotel because she'd remembered he liked extra pillows. The young couple on their honeymoon, whom she'd upgraded to a suite when she'd overheard them discussing their tight budget. The single mother who'd broken down crying at the desk because she'd lost her wallet, and how Emily had quietly covered the incidental deposit from her own pocket. These stories seemed to affect James more than any business report could. He listened with the intensity of someone who understood that she was describing the heart of what he tried to build, not just hotels, but places where people felt valued and cared for.
Then Emily told him about Richard Morrison. The daily humiliations, the fabricated reports, the casual cruelties inflicted on staff who couldn't fight back. She showed him the email she'd forwarded to herself, the timeline of events, the pattern of abuse that had been happening under the surface of the hotel's polished exterior. James's expression darkened as he reviewed the evidence. This was exactly what he'd feared when Emily had proposed her undercover plan, that she'd be vulnerable to the worst aspects of human nature, unable to defend herself without revealing her identity. But she had defended herself, he realized, just not in the way he'd expected. She'd defended herself by being impeccable in her work, by building alliances with her colleagues, by documenting everything methodically. He shared information with her that put the situation in sharper focus. The investigation into Richard Morrison had begun 3 weeks ago, triggered by a detailed report from an anonymous source. The report had outlined financial discrepancies, inventory manipulation, and a hostile work environment. Corporate had sent auditors who'd uncovered evidence of embezzlement, small amounts skimmed from various budgets over several years, carefully hidden but traceable once they knew what to look for. Richard had apparently realized the investigation was coming. His sudden decision to fire Emily, James theorized, was an attempt to remove someone he perceived as a threat. Perhaps he'd sensed she was too observant, too competent, too likely to notice the irregularities. Or perhaps he'd simply been a convenient scapegoat, someone he could blame if questions arose. Emily absorbed this information, feeling pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. The conversation turned to what would happen next. The investigation would continue, but it would expand to include interviews with all staff who'd worked under Richard's management. Emily would be interviewed like everyone else, her testimony treated with the same weight and scrutiny. But there was a complication, James pointed out. Once it became known that she was his daughter, her testimony might be viewed differently by some, either given too much weight or dismissed as nepotism. They needed to be strategic about how and when her identity was revealed. Emily had been thinking about this during the elevator ride up. She proposed that they let the investigation proceed with her participating as Emily Chen, former receptionist. Her testimony would be documented alongside everyone else's. Only after the investigation concluded would they reveal her true identity publicly. This way, the evidence would stand on its own merit without the complication of her family connection. James considered this carefully. It was risky. If her identity came out during the investigation, it could appear like they'd been hiding something, could undermine the process. But he also understood her reasoning. She wanted her experience to matter as itself, not as an appendage to her family name. They were still discussing options when James's phone rang. It was Marcus Peters, the legal director. James answered, listened for a moment, and his expression shifted to something between shock and anger. He thanked Marcus and ended the call. Richard Morrison had just resigned, effective immediately. But that wasn't the shocking part. In his resignation letter, he'd made allegations of his own, claiming that he'd discovered the owner's daughter was working undercover at the hotel and had been fired for legitimate performance issues. He was framing his resignation as a matter of principle, suggesting that the investigation was retaliation for his refusal to give Emily preferential treatment. The audacity of it was breathtaking. Richard was trying to flip the narrative to position himself as the victim and Emily as a spoiled heiress who couldn't handle being treated like a regular employee. Emily's hands clenched into fists. This was exactly what she had feared, that revealing her identity would become the story, overshadowing everything else. Richard was weaponizing her family connection, using it as a shield against his own misconduct. James was already making calls, coordinating with his legal and PR teams. The situation required careful handling. They needed to release a statement that addressed Richard's allegations while maintaining the integrity of the investigation. They needed to protect Emily while also respecting the experiences of the other staff who'd suffered under Richard's management.
But Emily had another idea. She asked her father to wait, to hold off on any public response. She wanted to go back downstairs to speak with the staff who were still working, to hear their stories directly. If this was going to become public anyway, she wanted the narrative to center not on her identity, but on the collective experience of everyone who'd worked under Richard's management. James was hesitant. The situation was volatile, and Emily was already emotionally invested. But he also recognized the determination in her eyes, the same quality that had led her to undertake this entire journey in the first place. He agreed, with the condition that Marcus Peters would accompany her as an observer. Richard's desperate counterattack threatens to turn Emily's noble experiment into a scandal. But as she prepares to face her former colleagues with the truth, an unexpected ally emerges with evidence that will change everything and reveal a connection Emily never saw coming.
Emily and Marcus Peters rode the elevator down together in silence. Marcus was 52, with gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He'd been with the Harrison hotel chain for 15 years, had guided the company through lawsuits and acquisitions, and had developed a reputation for fairness that made employees trust him even when they were being interviewed about sensitive matters. As they descended, Marcus spoke quietly. He told Emily that he'd suspected her identity about 4 months into her tenure at the Grand Riverside. Small things had tipped him off: the way she naturally understood complex hotel operations, her instinctive knowledge of brand standards, the fact that she'd never seemed intimidated by the luxury environment despite supposedly being new to high-end hospitality. He'd mentioned his suspicions to James, who'd confirmed them but asked Marcus to let the situation play out naturally. Emily was surprised, but also relieved. Having Marcus aware of her identity actually made this next part easier. He could serve as a witness to her authenticity, could confirm that she genuinely experienced everything she was about to describe. The elevator doors opened onto the lobby level. It was late afternoon now, nearly 4 o'clock, and the space had that peculiar energy of shift changes and early check-ins. Emily stepped out, and several staff members who were near the reception desk looked up. Word had clearly spread about Richard's suspension, about the investigation, and likely about Emily's connection to the owner. Sophia was still at the reception desk, along with 2 other receptionists from the evening shift. Behind them, Emily could see housekeeping staff, bellhops, and several restaurant employees gathered near the entrance to Riverside Grill. They were watching her, their expressions a mix of curiosity, confusion, and something that might have been betrayal. Emily walked toward the reception desk, her steps steady despite her racing heart. She'd faced Richard Morrison's cruelty for 6 months without flinching. She could face this too. She reached the desk and looked at the assembled staff. More were gathering now, drawn by some invisible communication network that exists in every workplace. Within minutes, there were 25 or 30 employees in the lobby, most of them trying to appear busy while obviously listening. Emily didn't raise her voice or make grand gestures. She simply spoke, clearly and honestly. She confirmed that, yes, she was James Harrison's daughter. She explained that she'd been working at the hotel anonymously for 6 months as part of her personal commitment to understand the business from the ground level before joining the executive team. She apologized for the deception, acknowledged that they had every right to feel misled. But then she continued. She told them that the experience had been the most valuable education of her life. She'd learned more about hospitality, about dignity, about human nature in 6 months at the reception desk than in 4 years of business school. She discovered that the heart of her father's company wasn't in the boardrooms or the financial statements, it was in people like them who showed up every day and made guests feel welcomed and valued. She talked about Richard Morrison without mentioning him by name at first. She described the pattern of abuse, the casual cruelties, the way he'd made staff feel small and replaceable. She explained that she had documented everything, not because she was looking for ammunition against him, but because she'd wanted to understand how systemic problems persisted in organizations. She'd seen it firsthand now. When management created a culture of fear, people stopped reporting problems. They endured instead of resisting. Then Emily did something unexpected. She asked them to share their stories, Not with her, not with Marcus Peters, but with each other. Right there in the lobby. She wanted to hear what they'd experienced, to create a space where their voices mattered. There was a long silence. Then Sophia spoke up. She described a time that Richard had blamed her for a mistake made by the night shift, had written her up formally despite her protests. She'd kept the write-up in her file, too afraid to challenge it, worried about losing her job. A bellhop named Carlos shared next. He talked about how Richard had once made him work a double shift, then docked his pay for unauthorized overtime. The contradiction was Kafkaesque, punished for following an order. One by one, stories emerged. A housekeeper who'd been berated for taking a sick day when her daughter had pneumonia. A restaurant server who'd been told she was too ethnically looking for the main dining room and should only work banquet events. A maintenance worker who'd reported a safety hazard and been assigned to the worst shifts as retaliation. The stories painted a picture of systematic abuse, of small cruelties and large injustices, of people who'd been made to feel powerless in an environment that should have valued them. And running through it all was a common thread. They'd felt alone, isolated, convinced that speaking up would only make things worse. Emily listened to all of it, and something shifted in the lobby. The staff who'd been watching her with suspicion began to see her differently, not as a wealthy daughter slumming with the working class, but as someone who'd experienced what they'd experienced, who'd chosen to stand with them rather than above them. Then something happened that no one had anticipated. David, Emily's ex-fiancé, emerged from the restaurant. He had apparently been having drinks in the bar after his lunch and had heard the commotion in the lobby. Madison was with him, looking distinctly uncomfortable. David approached the group, and everyone fell silent. He looked at Emily for a long moment, then spoke. His voice carried across the lobby, clear and remorseful. He said that he owed Emily an apology, not just for how their relationship had ended 2 years ago, but for his behavior earlier that day. He'd seen her working at the reception desk and had been confused, even judgmental. He'd mentioned it to people at lunch, had allowed his companion to make snide remarks, had contributed to the exposure of her identity. But listening to her speak just now, he understood something he should have understood years ago. Emily had always been the most genuine person he'd known, the one who questioned privilege rather than simply enjoying it, who believed that wealth came with responsibility. He had been too shallow to appreciate those qualities when they were together. He wanted a trophy, not a partner. Madison, standing beside David, looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. David turned briefly to her, and something unspoken passed between them. Then he looked back at Emily and told her that what she'd done, working here anonymously, experiencing this environment as a regular employee, was braver than anything he had ever attempted. She'd always been better than him, and he'd been too insecure to handle it. The apology was unexpected and oddly moving. Emily nodded acknowledgement, accepting it without dramatics. David and Madison retreated back toward the restaurant, and Emily turned her attention back to the staff. Marcus Peters, who'd been observing everything with his lawyer's eye for detail, stepped forward. He addressed the assembled employees directly. He explained that the investigation into Richard Morrison's conduct would continue and that every person who had experienced harassment or discrimination would have the opportunity to provide testimony. Their statements would be taken seriously, would be protected legally, and would be acted upon. But he also made something clear. Emily's identity didn't invalidate her experience. She'd been a receptionist for 6 months, had been paid the same wage as any other receptionist, and had been subject to the same management as everyone else. Her testimony would be included in the investigation with the same weight as all other testimony. But there was more. Marcus revealed something that changed the atmosphere in the room completely. The anonymous reports that had triggered the investigation hadn't come from Emily. They'd come from someone else entirely, someone who'd been documenting Richard's behavior for over 2 years. Marcus gestured toward the back office and a woman emerged. She was perhaps 60, with gray hair pulled back in a neat bun and kind eyes behind practical glasses. Several staff members gasped in recognition. This was Margaret Chan, the head of housekeeping, a woman who'd worked at the Grand Riverside for 25 years.
Margaret had been the anonymous source. She'd compiled reports, had documented incidents, had collected testimonies from staff members who'd confided in her over the years.
She'd waited for the right moment to bring everything forward, had been strategic and patient in building an irrefutable case. Emily stared at her, making a connection. Chen? Margaret Chen. Emily had been using her mother's maiden name during her time at the hotel. Emily Chen. She'd chosen it randomly, or so she thought, but now she wondered if there was a deeper connection. Margaret approached Emily, and tears welled in the older woman's eyes. She spoke softly, but her voice carried in the hushed lobby. She told Emily that she'd known her mother. Grace Chen had worked at the very first Harrison Hotel 40 years ago, had been one of the original housekeepers when James Harrison was just starting out. Grace had been Margaret's older sister. The revelation hit Emily like a physical blow. Her mother had passed away when Emily was 10, and she had only fragmented memories of her. Warmth, laughter, a gentle presence that had shaped her childhood. She'd known her mother had worked in hotels before marrying her father, but she'd never known the details. Margaret explained that Grace had been the one who taught James Harrison about genuine hospitality. She had shown him that luxury wasn't about expensive furnishings or Michelin stars. It was about making every person who walked through the door feel seen and valued. When James and Grace had fallen in love and married, it had been a scandal in their social circles. He was the up-and-coming hotel owner, she was a housekeeper. But their partnership had been the foundation of everything the Harrison Hotel chain became. Grace had insisted on policies that were revolutionary at the time: fair wages, healthcare benefits, respect for all staff regardless of position. She'd believed that employees who felt valued would create better experiences for guests. The entire philosophy of the Harrison Hotel chain, the thing that made it different from competitors, had come from her. After Grace died, James had continued building the business, but Margaret worried that some of the original values had been lost in the expansion. Middle managers like Richard Morrison had slipped through, had created toxic environments that Grace would have fought against. Margaret had been trying to protect her sister's legacy by documenting these problems, by ensuring that when the evidence was finally presented, it would be undeniable. When Margaret had realized who Emily was, and she had figured it out within 2 weeks of Emily starting at the hotel, she had seen it as a sign. Grace's daughter returning to the front lines of hospitality, unknowingly honoring her mother's legacy. Margaret had protected Emily's secret while also protecting Emily herself, had documented Richard's treatment of her most carefully because she knew it would be the most powerful evidence. Emily was crying now, unable to stop the tears. She'd undertaken this journey thinking she was discovering something new, but she'd actually been following in her mother's footsteps, connecting with a part of her heritage she'd never fully understood. Margaret pulled Emily into a hug, and the older woman whispered something meant only for her. She told Emily that Grace would have been so proud, that this was exactly the kind of courage and integrity her mother had embodied. The lobby had gone silent. Staff members were crying. Guests who had gathered to watch the drama were moved by something they couldn't fully understand. Even Marcus Peters looked affected, his professional composure cracking slightly. Sophia broke the silence by starting to clap. It began as a single person's applause, slow and deliberate, but it spread. Within seconds, the entire lobby was filled with applause. Staff, guests, even the security guard by the door. They weren't applauding Emily's identity or her family connection. They were applauding something more fundamental: courage, authenticity, the willingness to stand up for what was right, even when it required personal sacrifice.
The days following the lobby revelation moved quickly. Richard Morrison's resignation letter and his allegations made brief headlines in hospitality industry publications, but the story didn't gain the traction he'd hoped for. The evidence against him was too comprehensive, too well documented. Within 72 hours, 3 more former employees from other hotels where he'd worked came forward with similar complaints, painting a pattern that spanned years and multiple properties. The legal settlement was reached within 2 weeks. Richard agreed to never work in the hospitality industry again and to repay the embezzled funds. In exchange, criminal charges weren't pursued. Emily had mixed feelings about the outcome. Part of her wanted harsher consequences, but another part understood that sometimes justice was about protecting future victims rather than punishing past offenders. The Grand Riverside Hotel underwent significant changes. A new general manager was hired, a woman named Patricia Okafor, who'd worked her way up from front desk agent to regional director over 20 years. Her first act was implementing a transparent reporting system where staff could raise concerns without fear of retaliation. Emily participated in the development of this system, though her role had shifted. She was no longer a receptionist, but she wasn't quite ready to join the executive team either. Instead, her father created a new position for her, Director of Employee Experience, Corporate Division. Her job was to visit Harrison properties unannounced, to talk with staff at all levels, to ensure that the values her mother had instilled in the company were being honored. It was work that felt meaningful in a way that a traditional executive role might not have. Emily traveled constantly, spending weeks at different properties, often working shifts alongside regular employees. She'd learned during her 6 months at the Grand Riverside that you couldn't understand a hotel's culture from inspection reports. You had to live it. Sophia was promoted to assistant front desk manager at the Grand Riverside, a position she'd earned through competence and dedication. She and Emily remained close friends, texting regularly, meeting for dinner when Emily was in town. Their friendship had survived the revelation of Emily's identity because it had been built on genuine connection rather than social obligation. Margaret Chen retired from her housekeeping position, but joined the company's board of directors as an employee representative. It was an unprecedented move in the hospitality industry, having a former housekeeper with no formal business education serving alongside executives and investors. But James Harrison had insisted, and the board had agreed after hearing Margaret's insights into operational efficiency and employee satisfaction. Margaret and Emily developed a close relationship, filling a void in each other's lives. Margaret shared stories about Grace, about Emily's mother as a young woman full of dreams and determination. Emily learned that her mother had been a college student working her way through school when she'd taken the housekeeping job at James Harrison's first hotel. She'd seen potential in the young entrepreneur, had believed in his vision of ethical, people-centered hospitality. 3 months after the events at the Grand Riverside, the Harrison Hotel Corporation issued a comprehensive report on workplace culture across all properties. It was rare for a company to publicly acknowledge systemic problems, but James Harris had insisted on transparency. The report detailed the findings of the investigation, the corrective measures being implemented, and a commitment to ongoing monitoring. The response from the industry was mixed. Some competitors used it as ammunition, suggesting that Harrison Properties had serious problems, but others saw it as leadership, as a company willing to confront uncomfortable truths rather than hiding them. Several other hotel chains reached out privately, asking for guidance on implementing similar culture audits. For Emily, the most meaningful outcome was quieter and more personal. Staff members from various Harrison properties began reaching out to her directly, sharing their experiences, asking for advice, or simply thanking her for creating a space where their voices mattered. She responded to every message personally, understanding that this connection was the real work, not the policies or the procedures, but the human relationships that made those policies matter. 6 months after leaving the reception desk, Emily returned to the Grand Riverside Hotel. Not as an employee this time, but as a guest. She'd reserved a standard room, deliberately not using her family name or requesting any special treatment. She wanted to experience the hotel as her mother would have wanted guests to experience it, as a place of genuine welcome and care. The lobby looked the same, but felt different. There was a lightness in the air, a sense that the staff moved with more confidence and less fear. Emily approached the reception desk, where a young man she didn't recognize was working. His name tag identified him as James, a coincidence that made Emily smile. James, the receptionist, greeted her warmly, processed her check-in efficiently, and asked about her travel. The interaction lasted maybe 3 minutes, but it was perfect in its simplicity and authenticity. This was what hospitality was supposed to be. As Emily moved toward the elevators, she noticed a new addition to the lobby. Near the concierge desk was a plaque she hadn't seen before. She approached it, reading the dedication. In memory of Grace Chen Harrison, 1962 to 2007, whose vision of hospitality as an act of kindness continues to guide us. Everyone who walks through our doors is someone's beloved person. Treat them that way. Emily stood before the plaque, her hand resting on the cool metal, and felt a profound sense of completion. Her 6 months at the reception desk hadn't been about proving something to herself or others.
It had been about understanding the legacies he had inherited but never fully known. She thought about Richard Morrison occasionally, wondered if he'd learned anything from his downfall. She hoped so, though she wasn't optimistic. Some people are so invested in their view of themselves that they can't see the damage they cause others. But she thought more often about the people who'd shown her unexpected kindness during those 6 months. The elderly guest who'd noticed she looked tired and had given her a sealed energy bar from his bag. The fellow receptionist who'd covered for her when she needed a moment to compose herself after a particularly harsh encounter with Richard. The housekeeper who'd left encouraging notes in her locker, anonymous gifts of solidarity. These are the people who made the hospitality industry what it was supposed to be, not the managers with impressive titles or the executives with strategic visions, but the frontline workers who chose kindness every day, often in the face of disrespect and exhaustion. Emily's phone buzzed. A text from her father. "Free for dinner? Want to hear about your week."
She smiled and typed back, "Always. Meet you at 7?" The response came immediately. "Perfect. I'm proud of you, by the way, in case I don't say it enough." Emily felt tears prick her eyes again. She'd cried more in the past 6 months than in the previous 6 years. But these were different tears than the ones she'd shed in the supply closet or after encounters with Richard. These were tears of gratitude, of connection, of understanding her place in a story much larger than herself. She rode the elevator up to her room, unpacked her small suitcase, and looked out the window at the city below. Somewhere out there were thousands of hotel workers finishing their shifts, heading home to families, nursing sore feet and emotional exhaustion. They were the invisible infrastructure of travel, of business, of the modern world, and most people never thought about them at all. But Emily thought about them. She understood now what her mother had understood 40 years ago, that everyone deserves dignity in their work, that service is noble when it's respected, that the true measure of a company isn't its profits, but how it treats the people who generate those profits. The Grand Riverside investigation had led to concrete changes, better pay structures, clearer reporting mechanisms, training programs that emphasized respectful management. These were important, but they weren't enough. Real change would require constant vigilance, a commitment to listening to employees rather than just managing them. Emily had found her purpose, not in a boardroom or an executive suite, but in the space between policy and practice, between intention and action. She would spend her career working in that space, ensuring that her mother's vision of hospitality, as an act of kindness, remained central to her father's company. As the sun set over the city, Emily prepared for dinner with her father. She chose a simple dress, tied her hair back the way she'd worn it at the reception desk, and took one last look at herself in the mirror. She saw her mother's eyes looking back at her and her father's determination in the set of her jaw. She was Emily Chen Harrison, and she'd finally discovered what that meant. Not just a combination of two names, but a bridge between two worlds, privilege and service, power and humility, inheritance and earned respect. She would spend the rest of her life honoring both sides of that heritage. Downstairs in the lobby, life continued its rhythmic flow. Guests checked in and out. Staff members moved through their duties with practiced efficiency. The hotel breathed and hummed with the energy of hundreds of small human interactions. And somewhere in that complexity, in that beautiful chaos of hospitality, was the legacy of a woman who'd believed that treating people with dignity wasn't just good business, it was the only way to build something that would last. Emily stepped into the elevator, pressed the button for the lobby, and descended to meet her father for dinner. Tomorrow she'd fly to another property, would spend another week experiencing her family's business from the inside. But tonight, she'd simply be a daughter having dinner with her father, sharing stories and making plans. The elevator doors opened. Emily stepped out into the lobby, into the life she'd chosen, into a future that honored the past while creating something new. And for the first time in her 27 years, she felt completely, authentically, genuinely herself. The receptionist behind the desk, James, the young man who'd checked her in, looked up at her as she passed. It was a small gesture,
A moment of simple human recognition. But it was everything. Emily smiled back, and the circle was complete.
The Harrison Hotel Corporation's annual report made headlines in the hospitality industry. Employee retention rates were up 32% across all properties. Guest satisfaction scores had reached all-time highs. And most surprisingly, profits had increased despite significant investments in staff wages and benefits. The report included a special section written by Emily Chan Harrison, now officially Vice President of People and Culture. Her essay argued that treating employees with dignity wasn't just ethically right, it was economically smart. Happy employees created better experiences for guests. Better experiences led to loyalty. Loyalty led to sustained profitability. It was a simple equation that Grace Chen had understood 40 years ago, that James Harrison had built a company around, and that Emily was ensuring would continue into the next generation. Somewhere in Ohio, Richard Morrison read the article in a trade publication. He'd taken a job managing a small apartment complex, a significant come-down from luxury hotels. He told himself that he'd been unfairly targeted, that Emily's privilege had protected her while he'd been made a scapegoat. But in his most honest moments, usually late at night when sleep wouldn't come, he wondered if maybe he'd been the problem all along. At the Grand Riverside Hotel, Sophia welcomed a new receptionist on her first day. The young woman was nervous, overwhelmed by the marble lobby and the sophisticated guests. Sophia remembered feeling the same way, and she remembered someone who'd made it all seem manageable. She put her hand on the new receptionist's shoulder and told her that she'd do great, and if she ever needed anything, advice, support, or just someone to listen, Sophia's door was always open. It was a small gesture, but small gestures accumulated. They built cultures. They changed lives. In her office at corporate headquarters, Emily reviewed proposals for the next round of policy changes. One caught her attention, a suggestion from a housekeeper in Atlanta for a mentorship program where experienced staff could guide new employees. Emily approved it immediately, adding a note to expand it system-wide. Her phone rang. An employee from the Dallas property, someone she'd never met, calling to report a concern about a manager's behavior. Emily listened carefully, took detailed notes, assured the caller that the report would be investigated thoroughly and confidentially. This was her work now. This was her purpose, and it was exactly where she was supposed to be. Outside her window, the sun set over the city. Hotels across the country prepared for the evening rush. Thousands of employees, receptionists, housekeepers, bellhops, and restaurant servers continued their shifts, most of them unknown and unseen by the guests they served. But Emily saw them. She'd been one of them, and she'd spend her career ensuring that they were never invisible again.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.